Right now, it's mid-April 2026, and Microsoft is doing something that just seems, impossible.
Yeah, impossible is a pretty good word for it.
They just reported $81.3 billion in revenue for a single quarter. I mean, they are minting money faster than almost any corporate entity on Earth.
Right, and they successfully hit 15 million paid seats for their AI tools, too.
Exactly. So why, over the last few months, has Wall Street essentially wiped out an enormous chunk of their valuation? I mean, sending the stock plummeting by nearly 27%.
It's really the ultimate market disconnect. We are watching this race to become the world's first $4 trillion company, right?
Yeah.
And the front runner is reporting record-shattering numbers, yet the market is treating them like they just announced some kind of massive structural failure.
Well, welcome to today's custom-tailored deep dive. We are looking directly at you, the listener, to decode this exact mystery. Today, we are digging into the massive, incredibly expensive AI cloud flywheel of Microsoft.
Because we really need to figure out why investors are running for the exits while the cash registers are just, well, they're ringing nonstop.
Right. And to do that, we are synthesizing a massive stack of materials today. We've got their Q2 2026 earnings reports, equity research from CMB International, market analysis on the cloud wars from Finterra and investing.com.
And we're even pulling in some really candid ground-level sentiments from cloud engineers over on Reddit, which is fascinating.
Yeah, those Reddit threads are gold. But before we get into the financials, I want to talk about the visual backdrop you set up for us today.
Oh, yeah, the digital cityscape.
Right, the sprawling, futuristic digital cityscape that just sort of morphs into endless rows of glowing industrial server racks. It sets the perfect mood for this.
I thought so, yeah. Because today is fundamentally about the heavy metal, the physical reality of the cloud. It isn't magic. It's steel, it's silicon, and it requires just an absolute ocean of electricity.
So what does this all mean? Let's start by unpacking this surface-level contradiction, because Q2 was a juggernaut.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, revenue is up 17% year over year.
Right, and Microsoft Cloud revenue alone crossed $50 billion for the quarter.
Yeah.
And if you are an investor who loves stability, they have paid dividends for 21 consecutive years, and with a super conservative payout ratio of just over 21%.
Almost 21.19%.
Right, so everything looks invincible. But then you look at the stock price. It dropped from an all-time high of $555.45 in late 2025 to around $384 today.
Which is roughly a 23% drop year to date, with some analysts citing up to that 27% peak-to-trough correction you mentioned earlier.
It's like hitting a grand slam in the World Series, but the crowd is they're booing you.
That is a great way to put it. The headline numbers look invincible, yes. But if you look at the CMB International equity research, you start to see the cracks in the foundation.
Okay, what kind of cracks?
Take their GAAP net income. It surged 60% to $38.5 billion.
Which sounds amazing.
It sounds like a monumental operational victory.
Right.
But a massive chunk of that, about $7.6 billion, was just a net paper gain from their investments in OpenAI.
Oh, wow. So that isn't cash flow from actually selling software.
Exactly.
It's just an accounting bump because the startup they own a huge piece of got a higher private valuation.
Precisely. It masks the operational reality.
Yeah.
Wall Street is experiencing a severe shift in market psychology right now.
How so?
Well, we have officially moved out of the blind euphoria of the 2024 and 2025 AI boom, where just mentioning AI made your stock pop.
Right, the hype cycle.
Yeah. We have entered the era of what analysts are calling ROAI.
ROAI, like return on AI investment.
Exactly. Investors are terrified of the AI CapEx bubble.
I like to think of this transition using a historical analogy. It feels like it's 1860, right?
Okay.
And Microsoft is out there laying down titanium railroad tracks across the continent at $1 billion a mile.
Right.
But investors are suddenly waking up and realizing, wait, we don't even know if the passengers actually want to travel on this route yet. They are terrified we are building the most expensive, empty train network in human history.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it. But let's add the physical constraints to that railroad, because investors aren't just worried about empty trains.
What else are they worried about?
They are terrified of the sheer cost to the tracks themselves. They want to know if the tens of billions of dollars going out the door right now will ever generate a sustainable return.
Okay, let's unpack this CapEx number, because the spending is where the financials stop sounding like a software business.
Oh, completely.
It starts sounding like the GDP of a small nation. I mean, Microsoft's capital expenditure in Q2 alone was $37.5 billion.
Yeah, which is up 66% year over year.
And their projected CapEx for fiscal year 2026 is an unprecedented $148 billion.
And here is the data point that is keeping institutional investors awake at night. Roughly two-thirds of that $148 billion is being spent on what accountants classify as short-lived assets.
Wait, short-lived assets?
Yes, we are talking primarily about high-end compute hardware, so GPUs and CPUs.
Okay, let me try to wrap my head around that mechanism. Are they basically setting $100 billion on fire, buying graphics cards that run so hot and evolve so fast that they will be functionally obsolete in 24 to 6 months?
Well,
Because if I buy a steel stamping press for a car factory, that asset lasts decades.
right.
If I buy a server rack of AI chips, the depreciation clock is ticking the second it boots up.
I would push back slightly on the phrase setting it on fire because these chips are generating real revenue today.
Here.
But you are highlighting the exact structural fear the market has.
The depreciation.
The depreciation of that hardware is severe and the physical degradation is real. These AI chips run incredibly hot, right?
Yep.
They require liquid cooling systems and massive amounts of power.
Right.
And because of those aggressive hardware depreciation schedules and the eye-watering energy costs of running these hyperscale data centers, Microsoft's overall gross margins have actually dipped to 68%.
Oh, wow. I mean, 68% is still a great margin if you make physical goods.
Sure.
But that's a massive red flag for a legacy software monopoly. They are used to practically printing money with a zero marginal cost of reproduction.
Exactly. It changes their entire economic profile. But what's really fascinating here is the internal dynamic this creates. It is a true flywheel necessity.
The internal cannibalization.
Yes. Microsoft is trapped in a hardware supply constraint that is so tight, it's forcing them to make really painful choices.
Yeah, the Reddit engineers in our sources were talking a lot about this. I mean, Microsoft literally had to ration their own servers.
They did. During the quarter, Microsoft had to choose between allocating newly commissioned GPUs to their own first-party Copilot applications.
Just to keep the AI fast for their 15 million paid users.
Right. They had to choose between that or renting that raw compute power out to their Azure cloud customers who were practically begging for it.
Wait, let's explore the why behind that, because I want to make sure I understand the technical mechanism here. Why couldn't they just, split the difference, give half the servers to Copilot and half to the Azure clients?
Well, because training and running massive AI models like Copilot isn't like hosting a website. You can just spin up a virtual machine on a single server for an hour and be done with it.
Okay.
AI workloads require synchronous operations across tens of thousands of GPUs lashed together in a massive cluster.
Oh, I see.
So if you break up that cluster to rent out isolated instances to, say, a banking client on Azure, your AI training halts. You cannot partition the hardware easily.
So they were forced to make a painful choice, and they chose to feed their own software ecosystem first. They literally turned away guaranteed cloud revenue to protect the AI flywheel.
That's the reality. Now, Azure still grew at a phenomenal 39%.
Which is huge.
It is, but management stated explicitly that Azure would have topped 40% growth if they just had enough GPUs to plug in. It shows just how starved the entire global economy is for raw compute power right now.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If the infrastructure is devouring their margins and forcing them to turn away clients, who is actually writing the checks that keep this $148 billion flywheel spinning?
Right. Who is paying the bill?
Exactly. The mainstream narrative usually assumes OpenAI is carrying Microsoft on its back. But according to the tech insiders in our sources, it's actually the boring legacy corporate IT stuff that gives Microsoft its invulnerable edge.
Yeah, if we connect this to the bigger picture, we really have to look at the current state of the cloud wars.
Okay, let's look at the numbers.
Amazon's AWS still leads the market at 32%, with $111 billion in revenue. Azure is second at 20% with $75 billion.
Okay.
And Google Cloud, or GCP, is at 13% with $50 billion. So AWS is a $35 billion lead over Microsoft, but Azure is growing much faster.
Right. 39% growth for Azure compared to Amazon's 18%.
Exactly.
And those Reddit engineers point out exactly why Azure is catching up with such momentum. It's their enterprise lock-in. One engineer specifically called it the boomer core going cloud native. Microsoft completely dominates the legacy corporate world.
It is arguably their most formidable moat. Think about a massive global logistics firm or a sprawling federal government agency. They have been running their entire operation on Windows and Microsoft Office for 3 decades.
Let's ground this for you, the listener. Think about the laptop you use for work. To even log into it this morning, you probably had to ping a Microsoft server.
Yeah, absolutely.
That is Microsoft Entra ID, what they used to call Active Directory. It is the identity management system that controls every single employee's access, security clearances, and email. It is the central nervous system of modern corporate America.
Now imagine you are the chief information officer at one of these massive companies. You're finally moving your on-premise data centers to the cloud. You are not going to suddenly rip out your entire identity management nervous system and try to untangle 50,000 employees just to move to Amazon's cloud because it might save you 2% on compute costs.
No, of course not. You would lose your job before the migration was halfway done. The switching costs are astronomically high.
It's corporate inertia as a business model. It's just too painful to leave. And they probably get to bundle their existing Microsoft 365 contracts with their new Azure contracts to get bulk discounts, which lowers their accounting overhead. It's totally seamless.
It is seamless, and the stickiness is reflected in a critical financial metric called RPO, or Remaining Performance Obligations.
Right.
This is essentially Microsoft's commercial backlog. It's the money that corporate clients are contractually locked in to pay them over the next year or more. And that number currently sits at a staggering $625 billion.
$625 billion. It's massive.
Yeah, $625 billion in guaranteed backlog. That completely recontextualizes the $148 billion in CapEx. When you have a $600 billion safety net, laying down those titanium tracks doesn't seem quite as reckless.
It certainly provides a massive buffer. But, a moat only protects you from the armies are marching to your borders.
Right.
What happens when a competitor bypasses your battlefield entirely? We have to look at the existential threats facing Microsoft's path to $4 trillion, because right now, Alphabet is actually leading that market cap race.
True. Alphabet currently sits at $3.75 trillion compared to Microsoft's $3.60 trillion.
Yeah.
And Google has distinct architectural advantages. Their Gemini model is consistently topping various AI benchmarks. But more importantly, Google isn't fighting Microsoft purely on software. They are fighting them on silicon.
This is a crucial distinction. We talked about Microsoft's gross margins dropping because they're buying so many GPUs from NVIDIA.
Right, they are heavily dependent on them.
But Google is largely bypassing that specific hardware bottleneck. They design and use their own proprietary TPU's tensor processing units for their AI workloads.
I want to make sure we highlight the mechanism here because this is huge. A standard GPU is a general-purpose chip, but a TPU is what engineers call an ASIC, an application-specific integrated circuit.
Exactly.
Google built it purely to do the matrix math required for AI, and because they build it themselves, they aren't paying the massive 70+% gross margin markup that NVIDIA charges everyone else. Google isn't waiting in the same expensive hardware breadline as Microsoft.
They aren't. They control their own silicon destiny, which fundamentally changes their unit economics.
Yeah.
But beyond Google's hardware advantage, there is another threat highlighted in the Ventura report that I think hits closest to home for the end user.
And what's that?
It is the widespread emergence of Copilot fatigue.
Ah, right. The reality of enterprise AI adoption hitting a wall.
We mentioned earlier that Microsoft has 15 million paid seats for Copilot. But enterprise customers, those same sticky boomer core we talked about, are starting to question the actual return on investment.
I mean, if I am a CEO and I am paying a $30 per month premium for every single employee,
Right.
and all my employees are getting is, a glorified spell checker that sometimes hallucinates and makes up facts during the quarterly review, isn't that a massive vulnerability for Microsoft? I might not rip out Azure, but I will absolutely cancel those AI add-on subscriptions.
This raises an important question, and it's the core reason Wall Street is skeptical. Investors are asking, what happens when those initial one-year corporate Copilot contracts expire?
Will the CIOs renew them?
Exactly. If the answer is no, the whole AI revenue projection collapses. This is exactly why Microsoft is frantically pivoting from basic conversational chatbots to what the industry calls agentic AI.
Agentic AI. Let me see if I have the right analogy for this. Because right now, a chatbot is basically like a consultant. I prompt it, it gives me advice on how to write an email to HR, I evaluate the advice, and then I still have to go do the actual task. But an agentic AI is like the actual HR rep. It doesn't give me advice. It independently emails IT to order a laptop, creates the Enter ID profile, sets the permissions, and sends the new hire their welcome packet, all without me ever clicking a button. Am I understanding the shift correctly?
That is exactly the technical and practical distinction. Agentic AI refers to tools that autonomously execute complex, multi-step corporate workflows. It moves from passive assistance to active execution. The AI actually does the work.
Which changes the value proposition entirely. You know, a consultant who gives you a draft email isn't worth $30 a month. But a digital agent that can independently execute a massive supply chain procurement cycle, I would pay thousands for that.
It has to transition to execution. If AI cannot transition to doing the actual work, that massive $148 billion capital expenditure we talked about will be entirely impossible to justify to shareholders.
Right.
Delivering reliable agentic AI is the make-or-break pivot for 2026.
And they have to execute this massive technical pivot while navigating an absolute minefield of global regulations. The sources we reviewed read like a legal thriller. You have the FTC deeply probing Azure's licensing practices.
On the structural nature of their OpenAI partnership.
Yeah, exactly.
And over in Europe, the regulatory landscape is equally complex. The EU's Digital Markets Act recently forced Microsoft to unbundle Teams from their main software suite.
Which directly attacks that very enterprise bundle that makes them so sticky.
It does. Furthermore, we must look objectively at the geopolitical reality of the hardware supply chain.
The geopolitical constraints. You were talking about the tensions with China.
Yes. High-end silicon relies on incredibly complex global supply chains. Ongoing trade tensions and export controls regarding advanced semiconductor manufacturing are creating severe strains.
It's a multi-front war.
It really is. Microsoft is fighting structural hardware competition from Google's TPUs, physical supply chain constraints, enterprise ROI fatigue, and intense global regulatory scrutiny.
It is a high-stakes tightrope walk. To bring this all together for you listening, the AI cloud flywheel we've been exploring is spinning at breakneck speed. It is generating historic, mind-boggling revenue backed by a $625 billion corporate backlog. But it requires these eye-watering $148 billion capital investments just to keep it from stalling out.
Yeah, it's unprecedented.
Whether you are an institutional investor scrutinizing your portfolio, a cloud architect provisioning servers, or just someone logging into your digital workspace every morning, this infrastructure rebuild is fundamentally rewiring the underlying mechanics of the economy you participate in.
And that rewiring brings us to a final, lingering concept from our sources. It is a trend that wasn't deeply discussed in the main earnings calls, but one that might completely change the trajectory of the cloud as we know it.
What's the trend?
It is the rise of sovereign AI.
Sovereign AI, just the name sounds like a contradiction to the whole foundational premise of the cloud. I mean, the cloud is supposed to be everywhere. It is supposed to be borderless, massive, and perfectly fluid.
The original vision of the cloud was borderless, yes. But nations are increasingly demanding that their AI models and the massive lakes of citizens' data required to train them stay strictly within their own physical borders.
Wow, so true localization.
Exactly. This isn't theoretical anymore. We are seeing strict data localization laws in Europe and massive sovereign AI infrastructure initiatives across the Middle East and Asia.
Because governments view raw compute power and localized AI as matters of paramount national security.
Exactly. And as a result, Microsoft is having to build dedicated, physically isolated sovereignty zones within Azure.
So instead of a few massive, perfectly efficient global mega data centers where compute power can be dynamically routed to wherever it's cheapest, the future of the cloud might be deeply fragmented.
Deeply fragmented.
We are looking at dozens of ultra-expensive, highly secure, isolated national silos.
Which forces us to ask a structural question about the future of this industry. If the cloud loses its borderless scale, does the current business model of hyperscale efficiency completely break down?
That is a massive question.
Right. How does a company maintain its profit margins when international borders and geopolitics literally shatter the physical infrastructure of their network?
Wow. Think about that the next time you hear a headline about the race to $4 trillion. Because it turns out the record-breaking company in our story isn't just dealing with a skeptical crowd of investors. They are running on a track that is literally shifting, fragmenting, and cracking beneath their feet. Keep your eyes on those CapEx numbers, watch out for the shift to agentic AI, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.